Did you know that gladiators rarely died in battle? That daylight savings time was originally intended for bug collecting? And that the man who created the Headless Horseman also invented Santa Claus? Learn the truth behind these and much more in my new book, Facts That Aren't True. Link in the description. Professor Dave and I had a lot to say about John Lennox, mostly the things John Lennox was saying, not him as the person. I've got quite a lot more to say. Before I get into that, I'm going to be very critical, but I don't hold any animosity toward John Lennox. I kind of like Lennox because his arguments are just so weak and terrible. Now, that probably sounds weird, but this is what I mean. He is very, very intelligent, and I respect that. And he's honest enough to not jump to the vast majority of idiotic apologetic tropes. He doesn't treat apologetics like politics, where, in politics, you know that you can say something that you don't personally believe, but everybody else will believe it, and that's extremely effective. And politicians obviously do that, but it's obviously unethical. For example, like if I turn this on me, the reason you've never heard me say, oh, God knocked up a 13-year-old Mary, is because there isn't a shred of evidence that she was 13 years old, and instead there is substantial evidence that she would not have been. Now, I have heard that line before. I heard it for the first time many, many years ago, and initially I thought to myself, she probably would have been really young. And I don't know if I ever said it on like a TikTok debate a really long time ago. I don't think that I did, but I do remember thinking that. However, since then I've read studies, and because of those studies, because I'm aware of those studies, I can't endorse that position, and so I will never, ever say it. It's true. The more polarizing the message, the more effective it often is, and I'm running a business here, so being censorious, well, that's a good business model, right? But I couldn't live with myself peddling nonsense like that. And I see the same sort of thing in Lennox, even though I will strongly disagree with him here. A simpler way to put this is, I see Lennox as openly admitting that faith is a huge part of all the rhetoric that he gives on this. Whereas most online apologists, they pretend that science and history and philosophy proves what they believe, which is just terrible. To start here, Alex is going to ask a question and make a criticism that's a very popular one and one that I pretty much share. And Lennox has a response to it.
I think what a lot of people will think is, okay, the founders of the scientific method were Christian, but of course they were, because everyone was Christian. And if science does somehow undermine Christianity, then of course they would be Christians, because they hadn't invented the scientific method yet to undermine it. And so people will point to the findings of science and say that the explanatory power that these Christian men who wanted to understand the universe found in the scientific method removes the space needed for the explanatory power of God. Now, I know you disagree with that too, of course, but I was hoping you could tell us why.
Well, I think...
So essentially, Alex is making the argument, well, of course Christians pushed for the development of science because everybody was a Christian. So how does it get credit for it?
It is an argument that's pretty fair if you apply it to a limited proportion of the earth.
Yep.
But the interesting thing to me about that, and I've thought about it a fair bit because it's the obvious point to make, and it's a good point to make, is that modern science did not develop among the Chinese. And a lot of study was done on that particular topic by a very famous sinologist who actually, did he found the Academy of Sciences in China? I'm wrestling for his name. You probably know it.
I'm not sure I do.
But he did a lot of research, and he was principally a Marxist in his viewpoint. Mm-hmm. And that is what makes his conclusion very interesting. He certainly was the author of a massive dictionary of scientific science and all that.
Scientific science. I'm being mean.
Trying to explain within a Marxist framework why modern science of the type you described didn't arise in China. And the conclusion he came to was it was a difference in a fundamental presupposition of the idea that there was a unification in the sense that there was one creator who had created the universe and created the human mind to study it. And the Chinese didn't have that. That was his view. So it seems to me that that is an interesting response to this. If you take the whole world, modern science arose in a particular place, in a particular time, where in a sense the general background was Christian. But on the other hand, it didn't arise where the general background was very different. So I think that's how I would respond to it.
Oh boy. So I've heard this kind of rhetoric before in many different variations. I've heard the argument that, well, Christianity has the concept of original sin, and that inspired people to study nature because somehow the belief that we have original sin and that we are fallible was inspiration for, well, we need to study the natural world because our senses are imperfect. It's a cute idea, but I think it's an incredibly weak hypothesis. It's one that can't even be tested in any way, whereas what I think a better response to the specifically this thing between China and Europe that Lennox is talking about is it's not exactly testable, but the concepts behind an alternative hypothesis have actually been seen in other places in other times. My fundamental problem with these grounding science as being initiated or inspired by Christianity is the simple fact that we don't arrive at our beliefs through reason. We defend our beliefs through reason. And to me, that's exactly what's going on here. And yes, by what I just said, I do mean even scientific beliefs. You don't choose what you believe in. You are convinced of it by external influences that you don't decide and internal influences that you also do not decide. When the scientist says, oh, I did all this work to try to uncover the glory of God, or when somebody comes up with a theory that original sin was the inspiration for it, crediting God for it, I see it as absolutely no different than when people say, oh, it's supposed to rain today, but it didn't. Thank God. Oh, my particular political beliefs or whatever are endorsed by Jesus and the Bible because God is good and everyone believes that what they believe is good. So therefore, their beliefs come from God and their religion and their holy book, or God, Jesus, whatever, would be a supporter of whatever it is they say. That is, defending your beliefs using reason, or as Jonathan Haidt puts it, intuitions come first and then strategic reasoning comes second. I can actually grant a lot of things to Lennox and to these arguments, but it's not the slam dunk that they would think it is. So we could ask the question, what do we mean by influential, right? Because that's a little bit of a nebulous term. This thing influenced me to do X. Well, do we mean that it was inspirational or do we mean it was causative? I can believe that somebody who had a proclivity toward scientific inquiry, toward abolition, social justice, or whatever, I can believe that that person could be inspired by the words of the Bible, as long as they read the correct parts of it and then interpret those words, in a way that's consistent with their own biases. I could believe that they would read that and it would reinforce, this is the inspirational part of their beliefs in that. And then they would say, because we're not meta aware of how we form our ideas, they could say, oh, I got it from the Bible. And I can believe that that can happen. And I can believe that it's good or fortunate that that happened. But again, I'm discussing something here that I think it's kind of obvious that this is inspirational and not causative. And the important part is, by what I just laid out there, none of that means that, oh, well, whatever that person was motivated to do couldn't have happened otherwise. Without the Bible, so-and-so would have never led the abolition charge or anything like, or Galileo would have never done science if the Bible had never been written. If Buddhism was popular, widely popular throughout Europe instead of Christianity, there's no reason that you couldn't rationalize the same ideas in that kind of framework. Or more simply, in a world where the Bible never existed, could we have discovered the theory of relativity? Well, considering you literally can't discover relativity using the Bible, then the answer obviously cannot be no. And the idea that any of that was inspired by or even accelerated by the Christian faith, I think that's a really silly hypothesis. Now, I have in the last year or so heard a lot of arguments and studies that have looked at, well, Christianity indirectly played a large role in the development of science because Christianity, monks and others were really obsessed with copying scripture down. And because of that, lots of ancient manuscripts also got copied and preserved. And without that specific practice, perhaps the initiation of the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, could have been delayed. But it doesn't come from the Christian faith. Now, there's very much a double-edged sword to that. If you read The Darkening Age here, you learn that there was systematic and selective destruction of all kinds of ideas and also artwork and things from the ancient world. And while, yes, things were, a lot of historical figures, their works did get copied down by monks, sort of in addition to the scriptures and things they were copying down, it was still very selective in what they decided to copy. Things that they thought were overtly heretical did not get copied, and so there's an unimaginable amount that we lost as well. And what they would do from time to time is actually deliberately destroy ancient manuscripts in order to, there's a word for it, I can't remember, but they would scrape off the ink, rotate the manuscript 90 degrees, and then write some hymns or something on it. We can't say that if Christianity had never been developed, then some other means would not have inspired people to desire to copy down ancient material. But we can pretty easily imagine that if it weren't for Christianity, much more would have been preserved instead of deliberately destroyed. Now, back to the example that Lennox uses about why did the scientific revolution not start in China? Why instead did it start in Europe? I don't know who he's referencing because he doesn't give the name. I don't know about this work, but the idea that it was inspired by the Christian presuppositions, I think there's a far better idea. And that is the simple fact that China was an enormous, but extremely, or at least comparatively, much more homogenous society than Europe and the Middle East. I have to go on a weird tangent here. I promise that it's related. Somebody asked me just the other day, do you think that it's inevitable that if a planet has life, that life becomes complex and then extremely intelligent and then eventually becomes like us? I said no, because I think that there do have to be very specific conditions on a planet. So, for example, on one of Jupiter's moons, we may find life. I seriously doubt that life, if it exists there, is anything other than microbial. Now, why do I think that? I think that you really, really do need a planet that is tectonically active and a planet that has complex and dynamic weather, because plate tectonics lifts up, changes, and recycles the terrain. And so what that does is it unlocks nutrients that are buried in the soil and puts them into the biosphere. And dynamic weather also allows for a lot of the erosion that unlocks those kinds of things and uniquely sculpts landscapes. Plate tectonics also creates things like mountain ranges and basins, which create lots and lots of microclimates. So you can have a coast, a mountain range, and a rain shadow desert all in a very short span. And then just on the other side of it, perhaps you have a rainforest. What that does is it creates environmental pressure to drive evolution, to drive natural selection, to create all this diversity of life. If ecosystems don't change, then there isn't any selective pressure for life to diversify. Now, take that logic and apply it to the development of complex ideas and civilizations in an ecosystem that is very heterogeneous. The number of different languages and cultural practices and environments and all of this stuff in Eurasia and the Middle East is vastly different than in China at that time. China had as many, if not more people, and covered as much, if not more, land. However, I think it's no secret that the more different kinds of perspectives and different people with different beliefs and ideas you have all participating in and reacting to and sharing ideas, the greater the rate that those ideas proliferate. It should also be noted that I think we all kind of know, we learn like in elementary and middle school, that China progressed with inventions at a rate that Europe and the Middle East just didn't see at all. We got all kinds of ideas and things from them. An incredibly important one was the contour plow. So that allowed, Europeans to be able to tear and turn over their soil and be far more productive in the way they grew crops, which means they could feed more people, which means you could get your civilization to advance and perpetuate and get new ideas at an even greater rate. I think that idea makes far more logical sense. And again, I think there are analogs you can look at for that kind of thing. For example, Japan, I don't remember exactly when this started. Maybe it was the late 1600s, but they decided to become extremely isolationist. And that only ended at the either end of the 1800s or early 20th century. And they sent ambassadors all over the world. They toured Europe and the United States, and they came back and said, there's an incredible wealth of ideas from all these people, and these manufacturing and industrial and architectural, whatever ideas that they come up with are really fantastic. And it sucks that we never thought of this kind of thing. There's also the fact that I've been reading The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire by Richard Carrier. Reading that book has been really eye-opening for me because I've always kind of poo-pooed more ancient cultures for, not I don't necessarily blame them for not having science, but I've always kind of thought that, I don't know, I just looked down on their societies, I guess. But that book is showing me that people in that time were far, far more scientific than I gave them credit for. The book spans a pretty good chunk of history, but the majority, from what I've been able to tell by the reading, is most of those characters and figures are from before the Roman Empire was Christianized. So I think we have an example of people perpetuating, and there are tons of philosophical ideas from those early scientists in the Roman Empire where they speak philosophically about the pursuit of knowledge and what they're doing, and how there were different camps of different philosophical thoughts, like the atomists and different ones. And the inspiration for scientific thinking is so in your face in that early pre-Christian era. And so to credit Christianity with the advancement of science, I just don't buy it.
The same is true, I suppose, of the so-called conflict between Huxley and Wilberforce, after Darwin.
Yes,
that's represented as
this is a debate that happens just down the road at the Natural History Museum
here, the Natural History
in Oxford,
Museum.
And it's between Thomas Huxley, who is a sort of protege of Charles Darwin.
Yes.
And so the newly discovered idea of natural selection is being defended by Huxley, and then you've got the Bishop Wilberforce, who is arguing against it. And this is again seen as archetypal science evolution, undeniable fact, versus the
Yeah, that's right.
the
But
priest
it's
that
very
can't accept
interesting.
it.
I've read the whole debate,
Uh-huh.
and I find that many people haven't. And Wilberforce was the kind of cleric who was an amateur scientist. And he seemed to have a lot of leisure for doing that, which might tell us something about the church in those days.
Right.
And Huxley was dead against this. He wanted a professional class of scientists. That's the first. There was a strong bias against it. But when it came to the argument, I was fascinated to discover that very early on in his speech, Wilberforce said, I am not going to use religious arguments. I am only going to discuss the science. That's often left completely out of the discussion. And again, it was, what was his name, the professor of the history of science at the Open University said that this event should not be used to drive a wedge between science and Christianity.
I don't know how or where Lennox could have found a transcript for that debate, because I tried to find one and I absolutely could not. Now, he lives right in that area, so maybe he could be connected. Except I found a video from a historian of that university, and the historian just very clearly says there is no transcript of the debate. This is the video right here. It's called What Really Happened, Bad Faith number 15, and the channel is called God, New Evidence. And essentially what this guy says is there's this giant book published in the 1870s about, God versus science and all this stuff. And the Huxley debate isn't even mentioned in it. None of the newspapers at the time talked about it at all. The debate, it's been mythologized because Huxley supposedly had this really clever comeback, that he used against Wilberforce in the debate. But the debate, it really, at the time and for many years afterwards, it was just basically ignored. So I don't know what Lennox is talking about, and I find it a little, actually, kind of a little bit hard to believe.
As Anthony Flew is at the time, especially like quite well-known atheist professor who had sort of made a career at this point out of, in part, arguing about God's existence and was famed for his atheism.
He was a professor at Reading who was a world authority on David Hume. And who regarded miracles of the type of the Bible as violations of the law of nature, and they couldn't therefore occur. And what he said to me when I asked him about that, he said, I was wrong about Hume. All my writing about Hume would have to be rewritten, but I'll never live to do it. I thought it was very touching, actually. In other words, Hume's analysis of miracles is false. And that's another matter altogether about which I've written.
So this is what Lennox has written about David Hume. And the way that this misses the point is just like, what are you doing? Hume's argument about miracles is just very well put right here. No testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. Or, in plain speak, testimony can never prove a miracle because you'd have to establish that violations of the laws of nature would be less likely than somebody just simply either being wrong or lying or being mistaken. So this is apparently what Flew said. It's our knowledge of the laws of arithmetic, and in the more general sense, it's our knowledge of the laws of nature that enable us to recognize a claimant for miracles. I encourage you to read all this. I read all of it, and at the end, I was trying to figure out what Lennox was trying to argue, and also what Flew was trying to say. And like I said, the way this just completely misses the point is pretty wild. Flew's basic argument is, well, we need to know what the laws of physics are to know in the first place whether or not a claim even is a claim about a miracle. I don't disagree with that. I don't know if Lennox is really representing the implication of Flew's quote there at all, because what Lennox goes on to say, and where he, like I said, for the third time, completely misses the point is, Lennox says, you need to know the laws of physics to know when God is intervening. That has nothing to do with Hume's claim. Hume never claimed that a miracle is literally impossible. Hume never claimed that because we now know what the laws of nature are, we know that a miracle can't happen. The question is, can we ever have any sufficient reason to say that a miracle claim is the, best inference? Well, no, and nothing written here says otherwise. So lucky for us, Lennox is smart enough and honest enough to not give us convoluted arguments or to pretend that some sort of scientific evidence or whatever proves God. He gives us the takes that are really the only fair ones to bring up. And like I said, luckily, they're pretty easy to bat away. Thank you for watching, and you'll see me tomorrow.